Welcome, dear listener, to a gentle journey through ancient wisdom. Let your mind rest as we walk together along paths worn smooth by countless footsteps, where stories have been told for generations under starlit skies. Close your eyes and breathe deeply as we begin our peaceful wandering through tales that have comforted hearts for centuries. There once stood a humble house beside a great road that wound its way through valleys and over hills, connecting distant cities and forgotten villages. This was no ordinary dwelling, for it served as a refuge for weary travelers who sought shelter from the storms of life and the darkness of night. The house was built of warm stone that seemed to glow softly in the lamplight, with windows that welcomed strangers and a door that was never locked against those in need. The keeper of this house was an elderly man whose gentle eyes held depths of understanding that came only from years of listening to the stories of countless souls who had passed through his threshold. His hair was silver like moonlight on water, and his voice carried the soothing cadence of one who had learned that words, like seeds, grow best when planted with care and patience. Each evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, he would light the oil lamps that beckoned to travelers, their warm glow visible from far along the dusty road. On this particular evening, as autumn's breath began to whisper through the leaves, 3 travelers approached the house. The first was a young merchant, his pack heavy with goods, but his heart heavier still with questions about his purpose in the world. The second was a woman of middle years, her face marked by both laughter and sorrow, seeking wisdom to heal old wounds that refused to close. The third was an old shepherd, his weathered hands speaking of years spent tending flocks, his eyes searching for meaning in the twilight of his days. The keeper welcomed them with bowls of warm soup and soft bread, and as the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, he began to speak in his quiet, measured way. Every soul that passes through this door, he said, carries within it stories that echo the greatest truths of human existence. Tonight, as the world settles into peaceful slumber, let me share with you tales that have been passed down through generations, stories that speak to the deepest longings of the heart. The travelers settled into comfortable chairs around the fire, their faces illuminated by the gentle flames, their hearts open to receive whatever wisdom the evening might bring. Outside, the wind sang softly through the eaves, and the stars began their nightly dance across the velvet sky. Not far from this very place, the keeper began, his voice soft as silk, there lived a man of considerable wealth and standing in the community. He was known for his fairness in business and his generosity to those in need, yet like all fathers, he carried in his heart both great joy and deep sorrow. This man had 2 sons, and though he loved them equally, their hearts were as different as summer and winter, as different as the mountain and the valley. The elder son was everything a father might hope for in an heir. He rose with the dawn, worked alongside the servants in the fields, kept meticulous records of the household accounts, and never missed the evening prayers. His hands were calloused from honest labor, his clothes modest but clean, his manner respectful to all who knew him. He took pride in his father's approval and found satisfaction in the orderly rhythm of days well spent in service to family and tradition. The younger son, however, possessed a restless spirit that seemed to strain against the boundaries of his father's house like a wild bird against the bars of a cage. His eyes always seemed to be gazing toward the horizon, wondering what adventures and experiences lay beyond the familiar hills and valleys of his birthplace. He was not unkind or deliberately rebellious, but his heart yearned for something he could not name, something that seemed to call to him from the great wide world beyond his father's lands. As the seasons turned and the younger son grew into manhood, his restlessness grew as well, until finally he could contain it no longer. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the courtyard, he approached his father with a request that would change all their lives forever. "Father," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of determination and uncertainty, "I know that by law and custom I will inherit a portion of your estate when you pass from this world to the next, but I cannot wait for that distant day. My heart burns within me to see what lies beyond our borders, to make my own way in the world, to discover who I might become when I am no longer defined solely as your son." The father listened to these words with a heavy heart, for he had long seen this day approaching like a storm cloud on the horizon. He understood the yearning in his son's voice, for he too had once been young and filled with dreams of adventure. Yet he also knew, with the wisdom that comes from years of living, that the world could be a harsh teacher, and that the lessons it offered were often learned through pain and hardship. Still, love sometimes requires the courage to let go, even when holding on seems safer and wiser. The father looked into his younger son's eyes and saw not just youthful rebellion, but a sincere need to discover his own path through life. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his hopes and fears, he nodded slowly. "If this is truly what your heart requires," he said, "then I will not stand in your way. You shall have your inheritance now, though I pray you will use it wisely, and remember always that you carry our family's name wherever you may wander." The division of the estate was carried out with careful attention to fairness and law. The younger son received his portion in gold and goods that could be easily carried, while the elder son's inheritance remained in the lands and livestock that would continue to provide for the family's future. When all was prepared, the younger son embraced his father and brother, promising to send word of his adventures and to return when his wandering was done. And so he set out on the great road that passed by his father's house, his purse heavy with gold, his heart light with anticipation, his imagination painting glorious pictures of the wonders he would discover and the man he would become. The morning sun seemed to dance on his shoulders as he walked, and every step carried him further from the familiar and closer to the unknown. For a time, his journey unfolded like a wonderful dream. In the great cities where he stopped, he was welcomed as a young man of obvious means and breeding. He dressed in fine clothes, dined at the best tables, and made friends easily among others who lived for pleasure and excitement. His gold opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and he experienced delights he had never imagined in his father's house. He learned to appreciate fine wines and exotic foods, attended festivals and celebrations that lasted for days, and listened to philosophers and storytellers who spoke of wonders from distant lands. For the first time in his life, he felt truly free, unbound by expectations and duties, able to follow his desires wherever they might lead. The world seemed full of infinite possibilities, and he felt as though he were finally becoming the person he was meant to be. Yet gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the bright colors of his new life began to fade. The friends who had seemed so genuine when his purse was full grew distant as his resources dwindled. The pleasures that had once thrilled him began to feel hollow and repetitive. The freedom he had sought so eagerly began to feel less like liberation and more like drift, as though he were a leaf blown about by every passing wind with no true direction or purpose. One morning, he awoke in a strange room in a city whose name he could barely remember, and when he reached for his purse, he found it nearly empty. The last of his gold would barely pay for another week's lodging, and suddenly, the precarious nature of his situation became terrifyingly clear. His fair-weather friends melted away like snow in spring sunshine, and the doors that had once opened so readily now remained firmly closed. Desperation drove him to seek employment, but he quickly discovered that a life spent in pleasure had not prepared him for the practical skills needed to earn an honest living. His soft hands were unsuited for heavy labor. His education had focused on poetry and philosophy rather than practical crafts, and his proud bearing, developed in his father's house, made him seem arrogant to potential employers who worked with their hands for daily bread. Finally, he found work with a pig farmer on the outskirts of the city, the most degrading employment imaginable for one raised in his tradition. Day after day, he slopped through the mud, feeding swine and cleaning their pens, his fine clothes long since reduced to rags, his empty stomach growling as he watched the pigs eat their fill of pods that looked more appetizing than anything he could afford for his own meals. It was during these dark days, as he sat among the pigs in his misery and degradation, that the fog of self-deception finally lifted from his mind. He began to remember not just the restrictions and expectations of his father's house, but its warmth and security, its rhythms of meaningful work and genuine rest, its atmosphere of love and acceptance. He remembered how even the hired servants in his father's household were treated with dignity and kindness, how they were well fed and fairly compensated, how they slept each night under a roof that protected them from the storms. The realization struck him like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. He had been a fool. In his eagerness to escape what he saw as the confines of his father's love, he had traded a rich and meaningful life for empty pleasures that left him poorer than the humblest servant in his father's house. He had possessed everything that truly mattered, and he had thrown it all away in pursuit of shadows and illusions. But with this painful recognition came something else, something that surprised him with its power and intensity: hope. For he remembered his father's character, the depth of love that had allowed him to let his son go, even when it broke his heart. He remembered countless small acts of mercy and forgiveness he had witnessed over the years, the way his father dealt with servants who made mistakes, with neighbors who fell on hard times, with anyone who came to him in genuine need. Perhaps, he thought, just perhaps there might be a way home. Not to reclaim his lost status as a son, for he knew he had forfeited any right to that relationship through his foolishness and waste. But maybe if he humbled himself completely and acknowledged his failures honestly, his father might be willing to take him on as a servant. It would be no more than he deserved, and infinitely better than his current circumstances. The journey home was long and difficult, for he had no money for proper transport and little for food along the way. His feet, soft from years of easy living, blistered in his worn sandals, his empty stomach cramped with hunger. His sun-darkened skin and tattered clothes marked him as a beggar, and many who might once have welcomed him now turned away in disgust or suspicion. Yet with each painful step toward home, something within him seemed to strengthen and clarify. He rehearsed over and over the words he would speak to his father, practicing the speech that would acknowledge his unworthiness and plead for even the smallest place in the household he had abandoned. He would ask for nothing more than the opportunity to work for his daily bread under the roof where he had once been cherished as a beloved child. Meanwhile, many miles away, the father continued his daily routines, but his heart remained divided between his present duties and his absent son. Each evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, he would find himself walking to the highest point on his property, shading his eyes with his hand as he gazed down the long road that had carried his son away. His servants noticed these evening walks and understood their meaning, but they said nothing, respecting their master's grief and hope in equal measure. The elder son, who had remained faithful to his duties throughout his brother's absence, watched his father's nightly vigil with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He grieved for his father's obvious pain, but he also struggled to understand why so much love and attention seemed to be reserved for the son who had brought such dishonor to the family name. Day after day, he worked to maintain and improve the estate, taking on responsibilities that should have been shared with his brother, Yet his efforts seemed to go unnoticed while his father's thoughts remained fixed on the one who was absent. Then came the evening when the father's patient watching was finally rewarded. As he stood on his customary hill, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road, he saw a figure approaching in the distance. Something in the walker's posture, the particular way he carried himself despite his obvious exhaustion and poverty, sent a shock of recognition through the old man's heart. It was a recognition that went deeper than sight, a knowing that could only come from years of love and intimate familiarity. Without a moment's hesitation, the father gathered his robes and ran down the hill, his dignified bearing forgotten in the overwhelming joy of the moment. Servants and neighbors who witnessed this unprecedented display stopped their work to stare, for they had never seen their respected master abandon his customary composure so completely. But love has its own wisdom, and sometimes that wisdom requires the setting aside of social conventions in favor of deeper truths. The son, seeing his father approaching at a run, was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions he was not prepared to handle. His carefully rehearsed speech of penitence and plea for employment suddenly seemed inadequate for this moment of raw love and forgiveness. He had expected judgment, perhaps tempered by mercy if he were fortunate. He had not expected this passionate display of joy and welcome. Before he could speak the words he had practiced so carefully during his long journey home, his father's arms were around him, holding him close, weeping tears of pure happiness against his shoulder. The older man's hands, still strong despite his years, patted his son's back as if to convince himself that this reunion was real and not merely another of the dreams that had sustained him through the long months of waiting. "Father," the son finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion, "I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please, let me work as one of your hired servants, for I have learned through bitter experience how good and kind you are, even to those who serve you for wages." But the father seemed not to hear these words of self-condemnation. Instead, he called to his servants who had followed him down the hill, their faces reflecting their master's joy. "Quickly," he commanded, "bring the best robe in the house and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and kill the fatted calf, the one we have been saving for the most special of occasions. Tonight we feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead to us and is alive again, was lost and is found." As the household erupted in joyful preparation for the celebration, the elder son was returning from his work in the far fields. He heard the music and dancing from a great distance and wondered what could possibly occasion such festivity. When he drew close enough to ask one of the servants what was happening, the man's face broke into a broad smile. "Your brother has come home," he said, "and your father has ordered a great feast to celebrate his safe return." The elder son stopped in his tracks, feeling as though he had been struck a physical blow. His brother, who had shamed the family and squandered his inheritance on reckless living, was being welcomed with celebration and joy. Where was the period of probation, the time of proving himself worthy of readmittance to the family? Where were the consequences for his irresponsible choices and the pain he had caused? Unable to bring himself to enter the house and participate in what felt like a mockery of justice, the elder son remained outside in the gathering darkness, his heart churning with resentment and hurt. He had been faithful all these years, had worked without complaint to maintain and improve the family estate, had honored his father's name in the community, and yet he could not remember a single feast being given in his honor. The father, in the midst of his joy, noticed his elder son's absence and came out to find him standing alone in the courtyard. "My son," he said gently, "why do you remain outside when there is such cause for celebration within? Come and join us in our happiness." "How can you ask me to celebrate? the elder son replied, his voice tight with years of accumulated frustration. "For all these years I have slaved for you, never once disobeying your commands or bringing shame to our family name. Yet you never gave me so much as a young goat to share with my friends in a modest feast. But when this son of yours comes home, having devoured your property with prostitutes and wastrels, you kill the fatted calf and command the whole household to rejoice." The father listened to these words with infinite patience and compassion, understanding that they came not from mere jealousy, but from a deep wound that had been festering in his elder son's heart. He placed his hand gently on his faithful son's shoulder and spoke with all the love and tenderness of which his heart was capable. "My dear son," he said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. You need never doubt my love for you or your importance in this family. Your faithfulness and dedication have been the foundation upon which this household has stood firm through all our trials. But tonight we must celebrate and be glad, for your brother, who was as good as dead to us, is alive again. He was lost in the darkness of the world, and now he is found and brought safely home." The evening air grew soft around them as father and son stood together in the courtyard, the sounds of celebration drifting from the house like a gentle current, carrying them toward understanding. The elder son felt the hard knot of resentment in his chest beginning to loosen, not because his father's words answered all his questions or resolved all his feelings, but because love had spoken, and love has a way of healing wounds that logic alone cannot touch. Slowly, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the elder son allowed himself to be led into the house where his brother sat at the place of honor, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of his father's forgiveness. The two brothers looked at each other across the crowded room, and in that moment they both understood something profound about the nature of love and family, about loss and redemption, about the bonds that tie human hearts together in ways deeper than blood or law. The celebration continued late into the night with music and stories and laughter that seemed to rise up and mingle with the stars. The younger son, still dressed in the fine robe his father had placed upon him, found himself marveling at the grace that had transformed his shame into honor, his desperation into security, his exile into homecoming. The elder son, his heart gradually opening to joy, began to remember why his brother's return was indeed cause for celebration, for the family was whole again in ways it had not been for far too long. As the keeper of the house finished this story, he gazed into the dying embers of the fire, his voice growing even softer as the night deepened around them. The three travelers sat in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts of their own journeys, their own searches for home and belonging, their own experiences of being lost and found. "Love," the keeper said gently, "is the great mystery that transforms everything it touches. It does not count the cost of forgiveness or weigh the worthiness of its object. It simply loves, and in loving, it creates the possibility for redemption and renewal that exists nowhere else in all the world." The wind outside had grown quieter, and the road that passed by the house lay still and peaceful under the starlight. Yet, even in this tranquil hour, the keeper knew that somewhere along that road, other travelers were making their way through the darkness, some journeying away from home in search of something they thought they needed, others slowly finding their way back to love and acceptance they had once taken for granted. The young merchant, who had been listening with particular attention, shifted in his chair and spoke quietly into the comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," he said, "about my own journey and the choices that brought me to your door tonight. Like the younger son in your story, I have been seeking something in the world beyond my family's borders, though I am not sure I could name what it is I hope to find." The keeper nodded with understanding. "The heart's yearning for meaning and purpose is not something to be dismissed or ignored," he said. but sometimes we must travel far from home to discover what was always waiting for us there. And sometimes the greatest adventure is not in the seeking, but in the returning with new eyes to see the treasures we had overlooked. The woman, her face thoughtful in the firelight, added her own reflection. And what of those who remain behind, like the elder son? I have been the one who stayed, who fulfilled expectations and honored commitments, yet I find myself sometimes wondering if faithfulness is its own reward, or if it requires recognition from others to have meaning. Ah, said the keeper, you touch upon one of the deepest truths of human existence. The elder son's pain was real and valid, just as the younger son's need for adventure and self-discovery was real and valid. Love large enough to encompass both the wanderer and the faithful one, both the prodigal and the steady, is love that reflects something divine in its scope and generosity. The old shepherd, who had remained quiet throughout the story, finally spoke in a voice weathered by years of solitude and reflection. In my work with sheep, he said, I have learned that some will stray no matter how green the pasture or how secure the fold. It is their nature to wander, and a wise shepherd knows when to let them go and when to welcome them back. But the sheep that remain close to home are no less precious for their constancy. The keeper smiled at this wisdom born of practical experience. Indeed, he said, for those who tend the souls of others, as fathers tend children or shepherds tend flocks, learn that love must be both strong enough to hold and generous enough to release. It is a delicate balance that requires great wisdom and even greater trust. As the fire settled lower in the grate and the night grew deeper around them, the keeper rose to add another log to the flames. The wood caught quickly, sending up a shower of sparks that danced briefly in the air before disappearing into the darkness of the chimney. The renewed light played across the faces of his guests, revealing expressions of deep thoughtfulness and peaceful contemplation. The road that passes our door, the keeper continued, settling back into his chair, has witnessed countless stories of departure and return, of seeking and finding, of losing and being found again. Each traveler who passes carries within their heart some version of the ancient story you have just heard, for it is the story of every human soul that has ever struggled with questions of belonging and identity, of freedom and responsibility, of the courage to leave and the humility to return. The young merchant leaned forward slightly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. But what of those who never find their way home? He asked. What of those whose wandering leads them so far into darkness that they cannot find the path back to love and acceptance? The keeper was quiet for a long moment, considering this question with the seriousness it deserved. That, he said finally, is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Some souls seem to wander so far into the wilderness of their own choices that they lose sight entirely of the lights that might guide them home. Yet I've learned to believe that love is more persistent and resourceful than we can imagine, that it finds ways to reach even the most lost and isolated hearts, often through the kindness of strangers or the gentle persistence of those who refuse to give up hope. The woman nodded slowly, her own experiences clearly resonating with these words. Sometimes, she said, we become strangers to ourselves, lost in our own hearts, unable to find our way back to the person we once were, or forward to the person we might become. In such times, perhaps we need the kind of love that sees us not as we are, but as we could be. Yes, agreed the keeper, and that brings us to another story, one that shows how love sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, how compassion can bridge the deepest divisions between human hearts. He paused to sip from a cup of warm herbal tea that sat beside his chair, the steam rising like incense in the quiet air. There was once a road, he began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of one accustomed to storytelling. that wound down from the holy city through wild and dangerous country to the ancient city by the river. It was a road that many travelers used, though all who journeyed upon it knew of its perils. Bandits haunted the rocky passes where the way grew narrow and the hiding places were many. Yet trade and pilgrimage required that people traverse this dangerous path, and so they did, often in groups for safety, always with prayers upon their lips and vigilance in their hearts. On this particular road, on a day when the sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, a man walked alone, contrary to all wisdom and advice. He was a scholar and teacher, respected in his community for his knowledge of law and tradition, his meticulous attention to religious observance, and his reputation for righteous living. His journey was urgent, related to important matters of interpretation and judgment that awaited his attention in the river city, and he had chosen to travel quickly and alone rather than wait for a caravan that might delay him several days. He walked with the confident stride of one accustomed to respect and deference, his fine robes marking him as a person of learning and status. The leather satchel at his side contained scrolls and documents that represented years of study and reflection, and his mind was occupied with the complex questions of law and ethics that formed the substance of his profession. He paid little attention to the landscape around him, trusting in his own righteousness and the protection of heaven to see him safely to his destination. It was this preoccupation with higher matters, this confidence in his own invulnerability, that made him an easy target for the bandits who had been watching the road from their concealment among the rocks. They struck swiftly and without warning, emerging from the shadows like wolves upon a solitary sheep. The scholar's protests about his sacred mission and his importance to the community fell upon deaf ears, for these men recognized only the value of his fine clothes, his well-crafted sandals, and the possibility that his satchel might contain gold along with its scrolls. They beat him severely, taking not only his valuables, but also stripping him of his garments, leaving him naked and bleeding by the roadside. His carefully maintained dignity was torn away along with his robes, and his scholarly confidence was shattered along with his ribs. As the bandits disappeared back into the rocks with their plunder, the scholar lay in the dust, his body broken, his pride humbled, his very survival now dependent upon the mercy of strangers. The road grew quiet again, except for the sound of his labored breathing and the distant cry of vultures that had already begun to circle overhead. The sun that had seemed merely warm during his confident walk now beat down upon his exposed and wounded flesh with merciless intensity. Each breath sent sharp pains through his chest, and the taste of blood filled his mouth. His scholarly mind, trained in precise analysis and logical thought, now focused on the simple, desperate calculation of how long he might survive without help. As the morning wore on toward midday, the sound of footsteps on the road stirred hope in the scholar's failing consciousness. Through eyes swollen nearly shut, he could make out the figure of a man approaching, and as the figure drew closer, he recognized the distinctive robes and bearing of one of his own profession, a fellow teacher of the law who served in the great temple in the holy city. Surely, the scholar thought, here was deliverance at hand. This man would recognize a fellow servant of the sacred traditions, would understand the obligation to show mercy to one in distress, would provide the assistance that might mean the difference between life and death. With great effort, he managed to make a small sound, a weak cry for help that barely carried in the still air. The approaching figure slowed, then stopped, clearly aware that someone lay injured by the roadside. But instead of coming closer to investigate, the temple priest stood at a safe distance, studying the situation with evident reluctance and concern. The scholar could see him calculating, weighing obligations and considerations that seemed to pull him in different directions. After what felt like an eternity, the The priest stepped carefully around to the far side of the road and continued on his way, his pace noticeably quicker than before, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if determined not to look back. The scholar watched in disbelief as his hoped-for rescuer disappeared around a bend in the road, leaving him alone once again with his pain and his rapidly diminishing chances of survival. The priest, it seemed, had been constrained by laws of ritual purity that forbade contact with blood and the possibility of death, for such contact would render him unfit for his sacred duties in the temple. His obligations to the ceremonial requirements of his office had outweighed in his mind the obligation to show mercy to a suffering fellow human being. The irony was not lost on the scholar, even in his weakened state, that strict adherence to religious law had prevented an act of basic human compassion. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became more intense, another figure appeared on the road. This time it was a Levite, one of the hereditary assistants to the temple priesthood, a man whose family had served the sacred traditions for generations. Again, hope flickered in the scholar's heart, for surely this man would prove more compassionate than the first, more willing to risk ritual impurity for the sake of saving a life. The Levite, like the priest before him, approached close enough to assess the situation clearly. He could see the extent of the scholar's injuries, could hear his weak pleas for assistance, could understand that without immediate help, this man would surely die. But he too seemed to struggle with conflicting obligations, torn between the demands of compassion and the requirements of religious law. After a long moment of hesitation, the Levite also chose the path of ritual safety over human mercy. He crossed to the far side of the road and continued on his journey, perhaps telling himself that others better positioned to help would surely come along, perhaps convincing himself that the man was already beyond saving, perhaps simply unable to overcome the powerful conditioning of a lifetime spent in meticulous observance of ceremonial law. The scholar felt despair settling upon him like a heavy blanket. If his own people, those who shared his dedication to the sacred traditions and his understanding of divine law, would not stop to help him, what hope could there be? The sun was now directly overhead, and he could feel his strength ebbing away like water disappearing into desert sand. His lips were cracked and swollen, his vision growing dim, his breathing shallow and irregular. It was then, as he lay hovering between consciousness and oblivion, that he heard the soft sound of different footsteps on the road. These were not the measured steps of a religious professional or the hurried pace of someone eager to reach a destination. These were the steady, patient steps of someone accustomed to long journeys and careful observation of the world around him. Through his swollen eyes, the scholar could make out the approaching figure, and his heart sank even further. This was clearly a Samaritan, one of the people his own community regarded as heretics and outcasts, corrupted in their religious practices and hostile in their relations with those who worshipped in the holy city. If his own people had refused to help him, what could he expect from one of these traditional enemies? The Samaritan, however, seemed to operate according to a different set of priorities than the previous travelers. Instead of maintaining a safe distance while he assessed the situation, he came directly to where the scholar lay and knelt beside him in the dust. His hands, gentle despite their obvious strength, began to examine the extent of the injuries with the care of one experienced in treating the wounds that life inflicts upon the vulnerable. "Peace, my friend," the Samaritan said softly, his voice carrying an accent that marked his origins, but also a warmth that transcended all barriers of tribe and tradition. "You are badly hurt, but you are not beyond help. Lie still and let me do what I can to ease your pain and begin your healing." From a pack carried by his donkey, the Samaritan produced oil and wine, the traditional remedies for cleansing and soothing wounds. With infinite patience and gentleness, he began to clean the scholar's injuries, his touch careful not to cause unnecessary pain, but thorough enough to prevent infection and promote healing. He tore strips from his own garments to create bandages, using his precious supplies of oil and wine without regard for their cost or his own future needs. As he worked, the Samaritan spoke quietly, not expecting responses from his patient, but offering the comfort of a kind voice to one who had been abandoned in his greatest need. "I travel this road often in my trade," he said, "and I have seen the work of these bandits before. You are fortunate to be alive, my friend, and with proper care you will heal and be strong again." When the immediate treatment was complete and the scholar was as comfortable as the circumstances allowed, the Samaritan faced the question of what to do next. The injured man clearly could not continue his journey alone, yet the nearest town was still many miles away, and the heat of the day made travel dangerous for one in such weakened condition. Without hesitation, the Samaritan lifted the scholar onto his own donkey, supporting him carefully to prevent further injury. He himself walked alongside, one hand steadying his patient, the other leading the animal with patient care over the rough ground. The pace was slow and the sun was merciless, but the Samaritan never showed impatience or complained about the delay to his own plans. When they finally reached the town, the Samaritan brought the scholar to the finest inn available, a place known for its cleanliness and the skill of its keeper in caring for travelers. He negotiated not just for a room, but for the special attention and nursing care that the injured man would require during his recovery. "Take care of him," the Samaritan instructed the innkeeper, pressing silver coins into his hand. "Whatever he needs for his healing, provide it, and if the cost exceeds what I have given you, I will settle the account when I return this way in a few days." The scholar, drifting in and out of consciousness due to his injuries and exhaustion, was aware enough to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This stranger, this member of a despised people, was spending his own money, sacrificing his own time and plans, caring for him with a tenderness that his own religious brothers had denied him in his hour of greatest need. As the Samaritan prepared to continue his interrupted journey, he paused beside the bed where the scholar lay. "Rest now," he said gently. "Heal in body and spirit, and may your recovery bring you not just renewed strength, but renewed understanding of the bonds that connect all children of the same divine love." In the days that followed, as the scholar slowly regained his strength under the careful ministrations of the innkeeper and his staff, he had much time to reflect on what had occurred. His assumptions about goodness and righteousness, about who could be trusted and who should be feared, had been challenged in the most profound way possible. The priest and the Levite, men he would have considered his natural allies and sources of help, had chosen institutional purity over human compassion. The Samaritan, whom his tradition taught him to regard as spiritually inferior and morally suspect, had demonstrated a quality of love that transcended all boundaries of race, religion, and custom. When the Samaritan returned several days later, as he'd promised, he found the scholar sitting up in bed, color returned to his cheeks, strength flowing back into his limbs. The reunion was profound in its simplicity, for both men understood that something had changed between them that went far deeper than the mere healing of physical wounds. "How can I repay your kindness?" the scholar asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You have saved my life and shown me a compassion I did not know existed in this world." The Samaritan smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "The only payment I ask," he said, "is that you remember this when you encounter others in need. The road is long and dangerous for all of us, my friend, and we are all, in our different ways, vulnerable to the bandits of this world. When you have the opportunity to be the answer to someone else's prayer for help, remember this day and what love looks like when it acts without regard for convention or prejudice. The scholar nodded slowly, understanding that he had learned something that all his years of study had not taught him. True righteousness was not found in the careful observance of ritual laws or the maintenance of social distinctions, but in the willingness to see the divine image in every suffering human being and to respond with whatever mercy and kindness lay within one's power to give. As the keeper of the house finished this second story, the fire had burned even lower, casting longer shadows that seemed to dance with deeper meaning in the quiet room. The three travelers sat in contemplative silence, each absorbing the implications of what they had heard, each reflecting on their own encounters with unexpected kindness and their own opportunities to show mercy to others. The woman was the first to speak, her voice soft with recognition. "I have been both the wounded traveler and the one who passed by," she said. "There have been times when I desperately needed help and found it in the most unlikely places, and times when I let fear or prejudice prevent me from offering help to others who needed it." The old shepherd nodded in agreement. "The heart has its own logic," he said, "that sometimes runs counter to what our minds tell us about who deserves our care and attention. I have learned that the sheep that wander farthest from the expected paths are often the ones most in need of gentle guidance back to safety." The young merchant leaned forward, his eyes bright with understanding. "This story changes everything about how I think about my journey," he said. "I have been so focused on my destination, on my own plans and purposes, that I may have missed opportunities to be of service to others along the way. Perhaps the greatest treasures are found not in reaching our goals, but in how we treat those we encounter on the path." The keeper smiled at these insights, pleased to see how the ancient wisdom was taking root in contemporary hearts. "The road teaches us," he said, "that we are all fellow travelers, all vulnerable to the storms of life, all in need of the kindness of strangers. When we truly understand this, the divisions that seem so important in our daily lives begin to fade, and we begin to see each person we encounter as a sacred opportunity to practice love." He rose again to tend the fire, adding another log and stirring the embers until they blazed more brightly. The renewed light seemed to awaken fresh energy in the room, as if the stories themselves were kindling a warmth that went beyond the physical comfort of the hearth. "There is another tale," the keeper continued, settling back into his chair, "that speaks to how we are called to use the gifts and opportunities we have been given in this life. It is a story about stewardship and responsibility, about the mysterious ways in which our choices echo into eternity." The travelers settled more deeply into their chairs, ready to receive whatever wisdom the evening might continue to offer. Outside, the night had grown profound and still, with only the distant sound of wind in the trees and the soft hooting of an owl to remind them of the world beyond the warmth of their sheltered gathering. "In a certain kingdom," the keeper began, "there lived a wealthy merchant whose business required him to travel frequently to distant lands in search of rare goods and profitable ventures. He was known throughout the region for his keen judgment in matters of trade, his ability to recognize value where others saw only potential, and his skill in managing the complex enterprises that brought prosperity to his household and employment to many in his community. This merchant had built his fortune not through inheritance or good fortune alone, but through years of careful observation, calculated risks, and the patient cultivation of relationships with trading partners across many nations. His warehouse held treasures gathered from the far corners of the world, silks from the eastern kingdoms, spices from tropical islands, precious metals from mountain regions, and crafted goods that represented the finest skills of distant artisans. Yet, for all his success in accumulating wealth, the merchant understood that riches were meaningless unless they were put to productive use. He had seen too many fortunes dissipated through carelessness or poor judgment, too many promising ventures fail because they lacked proper oversight and management. He knew that true wealth lay not in what one possessed, but in what one could accomplish with wise stewardship of resources. As the years passed and the merchant grew older, he began to think more frequently about the legacy he would leave behind. His greatest concern was not the preservation of his accumulated wealth, but ensuring that those who came after him would have the wisdom and skill necessary to continue building upon what he had established. He wanted to be confident that his life's work would not end with his death, but would continue to grow and flourish in the hands of capable successors. The time came when urgent business required the merchant to undertake a particularly long and dangerous journey to a kingdom beyond the great desert, where new trade opportunities beckoned, but where the political situation was uncertain and the outcome of negotiations unpredictable. The journey would require many months, possibly more than a year, and there was always the possibility that he might not return at all. Before departing on this crucial expedition, the merchant called together 3 of his most trusted employees, men who had served in his household for many years and had demonstrated varying degrees of capability and initiative in their assigned responsibilities. He had watched these men carefully over time, noting their different approaches to work, their varying levels of ambition and creativity, and their diverse attitudes toward responsibility and risk. To each of these 3 servants, he entrusted a portion of his wealth, giving to each according to his assessment of their abilities and potential. The amounts were substantial in each case, for the merchant understood that meaningful responsibility required meaningful resources, and the true testing of character could only occur when the stakes were significant enough to matter. To the first servant, a man who had shown exceptional wisdom and initiative in previous assignments, the merchant entrusted 5 talents of silver, a sum equivalent to many years of wages for a skilled craftsman. This servant had repeatedly demonstrated an ability to see opportunities that others missed, to take calculated risks that led to substantial gains, and to manage complex projects with skill and integrity. To the second servant, whose abilities were considerable, though perhaps not quite as exceptional as the first, the merchant gave 2 talents of silver. This man had proven himself reliable and competent, capable of handling significant responsibilities with care and attention to detail, though he had not yet shown the kind of visionary leadership that might justify even greater trust. To the third servant, the merchant entrusted 1 talent of silver, still a considerable sum, but proportioned to what he perceived as this man's more limited capabilities and ambitions. This servant had been faithful in smaller tasks and had never betrayed the trust placed in him, but he had also shown little inclination to go beyond the minimum requirements of his position or to seek ways to expand his usefulness to the household. "Listen carefully," the merchant said to these 3 men as he prepared to depart. "I am entrusting each of you with a portion of my wealth, not as a gift to be hoarded or preserved unchanged, but as a tool to be used wisely in my absence. I expect each of you to employ these resources in ways that will benefit not only yourselves, but also the larger enterprise of which you are a part." He looked at each man in turn, his eyes serious but kind. "I do not expect you all to achieve the same results, for I understand that your circumstances and abilities differ, but I do expect each of you to do your utmost with what you have been given, to take reasonable risks in pursuit of worthy goals, and to remember that you will be accountable for your stewardship when I return." With these words, the merchant set out on his long journey, leaving behind not only his wealth but also his trust in the character and judgment of these 3 men. The weight of responsibility settled upon each of them differently, according to their individual natures and their understanding of what their master's expectations truly meant. The first servant, energized by the confidence shown in him and excited by the opportunities that such substantial resources opened up, immediately began to consider how he might best employ the 5 talents entrusted to his care. He understood that his master valued initiative and growth over mere preservation, and he was determined to prove worthy of the extraordinary trust that had been placed in him. After careful consideration of various possibilities, he decided to invest in a trading venture to the coastal cities, where he had observed growing demand for certain goods that could be obtained at favorable prices in their region. The investment was not without risk, for sea trade was subject to storms and piracy, but his analysis convinced him that the potential rewards justified the dangers involved. His judgment proved sound. The venture succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, yielding profits that doubled the original investment. Rather than resting on this success, the first servant reinvested both the original capital and the profits in an even more ambitious enterprise, this time organizing a caravan to the mountain regions where precious metals could be traded for manufactured goods that commanded high prices in the lowland markets. This second venture also prospered greatly, and by the time news came that his master was returning from his long journey, the first servant had transformed the original 5 talents into 10 talents, doubling the wealth that had been entrusted to his care. More importantly, he had established new trading relationships and developed systems of operation that promised continued prosperity long into the future. The second servant, though perhaps less bold in his vision than the first, was equally committed to honoring his master's trust through diligent effort and careful stewardship. He recognized that 2 talents, while less than what had been given to his colleague, still represented a significant opportunity to prove his worth and contribute to the household's prosperity. His approach was more conservative than that of the first servant, but it was nonetheless enterprising and thoughtful. He chose to invest in local ventures that he could oversee personally, using his knowledge of regional markets and his understanding of seasonal patterns to identify opportunities for steady, reliable growth. He purchased goods during times of surplus and stored them carefully until periods of scarcity drove up their value. He extended credit to trustworthy merchants at fair rates of interest, helping them expand their operations while generating steady income from his investments. He formed partnerships with skilled craftsmen, providing them with materials and working capital in exchange for shares in their increased production. Through these patient and prudent efforts, the second servant succeeded in doubling his master's investment as well, turning the original 2 talents into 4 talents by the time of the merchant's return. His achievements, while perhaps less spectacular than those of the first servant, demonstrated a solid understanding of business principles and a genuine commitment to growth and prosperity. The third servant, however, approached his responsibility from a fundamentally different perspective. Where his colleagues saw opportunity, he saw primarily danger. Where they perceived the master's expectations as encouragement to take initiative, he interpreted them as warnings about the consequences of failure. The weight of accountability felt to him less like an invitation to excel and more like a burden to be endured until his master's return. His fundamental concern was not how to increase the value of what had been entrusted to him, but how to ensure that he would not be held responsible for any loss or diminishment of the original investment. In his mind, the safest course was also the wisest course, and the wisest course was to take no risks whatsoever with his master's money. After much anxious deliberation, he decided that the best way to protect the single talent entrusted to his care was to bury it in a secure location where it would be safe from thieves, fire, flood, or any other disaster that might threaten its preservation. He wrapped the silver carefully in cloth, placed it in a strong box, and buried it in a secret spot in his master's garden, marking the location carefully so that he could retrieve it when the time came for accounting. Having taken this action, the third servant felt a sense of relief that his responsibility was now manageable. He could continue his daily duties without the anxiety of wondering whether his investments were performing well or whether market conditions might turn against him. The talent was safe, and when his master returned, he would be able to present it exactly as it had been given to him, without loss or diminishment. The months passed, and eventually word came that the merchant was indeed returning from his long journey. The venture had been successful beyond his expectations, opening new markets and establishing relationships that would benefit his business for years to come. More importantly for the three servants, the time had come for them to give an account of their stewardship of the resources that had been placed in their care. The merchant called each of the three men to meet with him privately, for he understood that the conversation about their performance and its implications for their future roles in his household was too important and too personal to be conducted in the presence of others. He approached these meetings not as a judge, seeking to condemn failure, but as a teacher, hoping to understand what his servants had learned during his absence. The first servant came forward with obvious excitement and confidence, eager to share the results of his efforts and the strategies he had employed to achieve them. "Master," he said, "you entrusted me with 5 talents, and I am pleased to report that through careful planning and diligent effort, I have been able to turn them into 10 talents. He proceeded to give a detailed account of his various ventures, explaining his reasoning for each investment decision, describing the challenges he had encountered and how he had overcome them, and outlining the ongoing opportunities that his initiatives had created for future growth. His report demonstrated not only the financial success of his efforts, but also the depth of understanding he had gained about business principles and market dynamics. The merchant listened with growing satisfaction and pride, recognizing in his servant's account evidence of exactly the kind of growth in wisdom and capability that he had hoped to encourage. This man had not merely preserved what had been given to him, but had used it as a foundation for learning, for taking initiative, and for creating value that extended far beyond the original investment. "Well done, my good and faithful servant," the merchant said with genuine warmth and approval. "You have proven yourself trustworthy in handling a large responsibility, and you have shown the kind of judgment and initiative that will serve you well in even greater roles. Because of your faithfulness and success, I am promoting you to a position of authority over many of my business enterprises. Come and share in the joy of building something meaningful and lasting." The second servant, encouraged by what he had observed of his master's reaction to the first report, came forward with his own account of stewardship. "Master," he said, "you entrusted me with 2 talents, and I have worked diligently to honor that trust. Through careful investment and patient effort, I have been able to turn them into 4 talents. His report, while perhaps less dramatic than that of the first servant, demonstrated the same fundamental commitment to growth and responsibility. He had taken his master's resources seriously, had used them thoughtfully and productively, and had achieved results that clearly exceeded mere preservation of the original investment. The merchant's response was equally warm and affirming. "Well done, my good and faithful servant," he said. "You too have proven yourself trustworthy with what was given to you, and you have shown the kind of steady reliability and sound judgment that are essential to any successful enterprise. You also will be given greater responsibilities and opportunities to grow in your service to this household." Then came the turn of the third servant, who approached with obvious reluctance and anxiety. His body language and expression revealed his expectation of criticism, and his voice carried a defensive tone as he began to speak. "Master," he said, "I knew that you are a demanding man, one who expects results even in difficult circumstances, who harvests where you have not sown and gathers where you have not scattered seed." The merchant's expression grew more serious as he listened to these words, for they revealed an understanding of his character and expectations that was fundamentally flawed and troubling. He said nothing, however, allowing his servant to continue with his explanation. "Because I was afraid of your reaction if anything went wrong. The third servant continued, I decided that the safest course was to preserve your talent exactly as you gave it to me. I buried it in a secure place where it would be protected from any possible harm or loss. Here it is, returned to you without any diminishment or damage. See, with these words he produced the talent, carefully wrapped and preserved exactly as it had been when first entrusted to his care. He presented it to his master with the air of one who expected to be commended for his caution and his success in avoiding any risk of loss. The merchant's response, however, was far from what the third servant had anticipated. His face reflected disappointment and sadness rather than approval, and his voice carried a tone of gentle rebuke rather than commendation. My friend, he said, you have misunderstood both my character and my expectations in ways that have prevented you from growing into the person you might have become. He paused, choosing his words carefully, for he genuinely cared about this servant and wanted him to understand where his thinking had gone astray. You say that you know me to be a demanding man who expects unreasonable results, but if that were truly your understanding of my character, should that not have motivated you to at least try to achieve some growth with what I gave you? The servant shifted uncomfortably, beginning to realize that his logic had contained flaws he had not previously recognized. Even if you had been too afraid to invest in trading ventures or business partnerships, the merchant continued, you could have at least deposited the money with bankers who would have paid interest on it. That would have involved virtually no risk while still producing some return on the investment. Instead, you chose to do nothing at all, and in doing so, you have deprived not only me but also yourself of the opportunity to discover what you might have been capable of achieving. The merchant's voice grew sadder as he continued, but the real tragedy here is not the lost opportunity for profit, but the lost opportunity for your own growth and development. The other servants have learned valuable lessons about initiative, judgment, and responsibility. They have discovered capabilities within themselves that they might never have known existed. They have grown in confidence and wisdom through meeting challenges and overcoming obstacles. He looked directly into the third servant's eyes, his expression compassionate but serious. You, however, have learned only to be more afraid, more convinced of your own limitations, more certain that the safest path is to do nothing at all. This is not the kind of growth I hope to encourage in you, and it is not the kind of character that will serve you well in the responsibilities you will face in life. The consequence of this fundamental difference in approach and understanding was that the third servant found his role in the household fundamentally changed. The single talent was taken from him and given to the first servant, who had demonstrated the wisdom and initiative to use resources productively. The third servant was reassigned to duties that required less initiative and involved fewer opportunities for independent judgment. For everyone who has, the merchant explained gently, more will be given, and they will have abundance. But from those who have not, even what they think they have will be taken away. This is not arbitrary punishment, but the natural consequence of different approaches to responsibility and growth. As the keeper of the house concluded this story, the fire had settled into a steady glow that filled the room with comfortable warmth without the dramatic flicker of flames. The late hour had brought a profound stillness to the world outside, and the three travelers sat in thoughtful contemplation of all they had heard. The young merchant was the first to break the silence, his voice reflecting deep consideration of the story's implications for his own life and choices. I find myself wondering, he said, which of the three servants I have been in my own life, and which I am called to become. There have been times when I have been bold in pursuing opportunities, but also times when fear has prevented me from taking risks that might have led to growth. The woman nodded thoughtfully. The story makes me think about the different ways we can fail to live up to our potential, she said. The third servant's failure was not malicious or rebellious, but it was nonetheless real. Sometimes our very desire to avoid making mistakes can prevent us from making any meaningful progress at all. The old shepherd leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "In my work," he said, "I have learned that sheep must sometimes venture into new pastures to find the best grazing. Those that refuse to leave familiar ground may feel safer, but they often end up malnourished. Growth requires a willingness to move beyond what we have always known." The keeper smiled at these insights, pleased to see how each traveler was finding personal meaning in the ancient tale. "The story teaches us," he said, "that we are all stewards of gifts and opportunities, whether great or small. The measure of our faithfulness is not in the size of what we have been given, but in how fully we develop and use whatever is entrusted to our care." He rose once more to tend the fire, but this time he allowed it to burn lower, for the night was advancing, and the next story would require a different kind of atmosphere, more intimate and contemplative. "There is another tale that speaks to the importance of being prepared for the most significant moments of our lives," he said, settling back into his chair. "It is a story about wisdom and foolishness, about foresight and neglect, about the consequences of the small daily choices that determine whether we are ready when great opportunities present themselves." The travelers drew their chairs slightly closer, sensing that this next story would require their closest attention and deepest reflection. The keeper's voice grew softer, more meditative, as he began to weave the tale that would carry them deeper into the mysteries of wise living. "In a certain village," he began, "there lived 10 young women who had been chosen for the great honor of participating in a wedding celebration that promised to be the most magnificent event the community had witnessed in many years. The bridegroom was a man of considerable wealth and standing, known for his generosity and kindness, and the bride was beloved by all who knew her for her grace and virtue. According to the customs of the time, these 10 young women were to serve as attendants to the bride, accompanying her in the ceremonial procession that would mark the beginning of the wedding festivities. Their role was both practical and symbolic, for they would carry lamps to light the way during the evening procession and would represent the joy and celebration that surrounded the union of 2 hearts in love. The wedding plans had been made with great care and attention to every detail, but one element remained uncertain: the exact timing of the bridegroom's arrival. Tradition required that he come to claim his bride at an hour of his own choosing, often late in the evening or even during the night, as a symbol of the unexpected and precious nature of true love. The bride and her attendants were expected to be ready whenever that moment might arrive, prepared to join the procession that would culminate in the great feast of celebration. All 10 young women understood their responsibilities and were excited about their participation in such a joyous occasion. They had prepared their finest garments, practiced the songs they would sing during the procession, and made ready the special lamps they would carry to illuminate the bride's path. These lamps were beautiful objects in themselves, crafted of polished bronze and designed to cast a warm, steady light that would create an atmosphere of magic and wonder. However, as the day of the wedding approached, a subtle but crucial difference became apparent in how the 10 young women had prepared for their role. 5 of them, whom we might call wise in their foresight, had given careful thought to all the practical requirements of their duties. They had not only prepared their lamps and tested them to ensure they would burn brightly, but they had also brought along extra oil in small flasks, understanding that a lamp's beauty and craftsmanship meant nothing if it lacked the fuel necessary to fulfill its purpose. These 5 women had learned from the experience of others who had participated in similar celebrations. They knew that wedding processions sometimes began much later than originally planned, that the joy of the occasion often led to extended festivities that could last well into the night, and that a lamp that began the evening burning brightly might sputter and die if not properly supplied with oil. Their preparation was thorough and thoughtful, based on understanding rather than mere enthusiasm. The other 5 young women, equally sincere in their desire to honor the bride and participate faithfully in the celebration, had nonetheless been less thorough in their preparation. They had focused their attention on the more visible aspects of their role, their clothing, their appearance, the positioning of their lamps, but had not given adequate thought to the practical requirements that would sustain them throughout the entire celebration. Their lamps were just as beautiful as those of their companions, and their initial enthusiasm was just as genuine. They had oil enough to begin the evening with bright flames that would contribute to the magical atmosphere everyone hoped to create. But they had not brought additional oil, either because they had not thought carefully about how long the celebration might last, or because they had assumed that their initial supply would be sufficient for whatever the evening might require. As the appointed day arrived, all 10 young women gathered at the bride's house in the early evening, their lamps lit and glowing warmly in the gathering twilight. They chatted excitedly among themselves, sharing their anticipation of the wonderful celebration to come and their pride in being chosen for such an important role. The bride herself was radiant with happiness, and the entire household buzzed with the kind of joyful energy that surrounds truly special occasions. The hours passed pleasantly as they waited for word of the bridegroom's approach. The conversation flowed easily among the young women, covering topics from the beauty of the bride's dress to speculation about the feast that would follow the ceremony. Their lamps continued to burn steadily, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the room with warm golden light. But as the night grew deeper and still no word came of the bridegroom's arrival, some of the young women began to grow drowsy. The excitement that had sustained them earlier in the evening gradually gave way to the natural fatigue that comes with late hours and the need for rest. One by one, they found comfortable places to recline, and before long, all 10 had fallen asleep, their lamps still burning but now unattended. They slept peacefully for several hours, their dreams perhaps filled with visions of the celebration to come. The bride's house grew quiet except for the soft sound of their breathing and the gentle flickering of the lamp flames. Outside, the village settled into the deep stillness of night, with only the occasional sound of a night bird or the distant barking of a dog to break the silence. It was well past midnight when a sudden shout pierced the quiet air. "Look! The bridegroom is coming! Come out to meet him!" The cry was taken up by multiple voices as word spread quickly through the sleeping household and beyond. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived, and the celebration could begin in earnest. All 10 young women awoke instantly, their hearts racing with excitement and their minds immediately focused on their responsibilities. They hurried to gather their lamps and prepare to join the procession that would escort the bridegroom to claim his bride. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the culmination of all their planning and anticipation. But as they reached for their lamps in the darkness, 5 of the women made a dismaying discovery. The oil in their lamps had burned low during the long hours of waiting, and the flames that had burned so brightly earlier in the evening were now reduced to weak, flickering lights that threatened to go out entirely. In their excitement to be part of the celebration, they had not prepared for the possibility that the bridegroom's arrival might be delayed so long. The 5 wise women, however, found that while their lamps also showed signs of the long burning, they had the extra oil needed to replenish them and ensure that they would burn brightly throughout the procession and celebration. They quickly refilled their lamps, and the flames rose again to their full brilliance, ready to provide the light that would honor the bridegroom and guide the wedding party. Seeing the predicament of their companions, the 5 women whose lamps were failing asked urgently, "Please share some of your oil with us, for our lamps are going out and we will not be able to fulfill our role in the procession." The wise women found themselves in a difficult position, torn between their desire to help their friends and their understanding of practical realities. "We wish we could share with you," they replied with genuine regret. "But we only have enough oil for our own lamps to last through the entire celebration. If we divide what we have among all 10 lamps, none of us will have enough to keep our flames burning brightly throughout the night. Your best option is to go quickly to the oil merchants and purchase what you need." This advice, while practical, presented its own challenges. It was very late at night, most merchants would be sleeping, and finding someone willing to sell oil at such an hour would require time and effort. But the 5 women with failing lamps had no other choice, so they hurried away into the darkness, hoping to find a merchant who could supply their urgent need. While they were gone on this necessary but time-consuming errand, the bridegroom arrived in all his splendor, accompanied by his friends and attendants in a joyous procession that filled the night air with music and laughter. The 5 wise women, their lamps burning brightly, joined the celebration immediately, taking their places in the ceremonial procession that escorted the couple to the wedding feast. The bride, beautiful in her wedding garments and glowing with happiness, was united with her beloved in a ceremony that was everything the community had hoped it would be. The procession moved through the village streets lit by the warm glow of the attendants' lamps, creating a magical atmosphere that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. When the procession reached the house where the wedding feast was to be held, all the participants entered for the celebration that would continue through the rest of the night. The doors were then closed according to custom, marking the beginning of the private celebration reserved for invited guests and members of the wedding party. It was some time later when the 5 women who had gone in search of oil finally returned, having succeeded in finding a merchant willing to open his shop and sell them what they needed. Their lamps were now burning brightly again, and they hurried to the feast house, expecting to take their places in the celebration and fulfill their roles as wedding attendants. But when they reached the doors of the feast house, they found them barred against late arrivals. The celebration had begun, the ceremonial roles had been filled by those who were present and prepared, and the intimate nature of the gathering did not allow for interruptions or late additions to the guest list. "Please," they called through the doors, "open for us. We are the other 5 attendants, and we have been chosen to participate in this celebration. We were delayed only because we had to purchase oil for our lamps." But the response from within was final and unchangeable. "I tell you truly, I do not know you." The roles they had been selected to fill had been filled by others who were ready when the crucial moment arrived. Their opportunity had passed, not through any malicious exclusion, but through the simple reality that important moments do not wait for those who are unprepared. The 5 women stood outside in the darkness, their lamps now burning brightly but uselessly, their beautiful garments prepared for a celebration they could no longer join. They could hear the sounds of joy and festivity from within, could see the light streaming from the windows, could smell the aromas of the feast they had hoped to share. But they were now observers rather than participants, excluded not by cruelty, but by the consequences of their own lack of foresight. As the keeper concluded this story, the room had grown very quiet, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers that cast only the softest light on the faces of his listeners. The late hour and the weight of the story's message seemed to settle over them like a gentle but serious blanket, encouraging deep reflection on the nature of preparation and readiness. The young merchant spoke first, his voice thoughtful and slightly subdued. "This story troubles me," he said, "because I recognize myself in both groups of women. There have been times when I have prepared carefully for important opportunities, and times when I have relied on enthusiasm alone without thinking through all the practical requirements." The woman nodded slowly. "What strikes me most," she said, "is how similar all 10 women were in their initial eagerness and good intentions. The difference between them was not in their hearts or their desires, but in their understanding of what true preparation requires. The old shepherd leaned forward slightly, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the embers. "In tending sheep," he said, "I have learned that good intentions mean nothing when wolves appear. The sheep that survive are those whose shepherd has prepared for danger, not just hoped it would not come." The keeper stirred the embers with a poker, sending up a small shower of sparks that danced briefly in the air before disappearing. "The story teaches us," he said, "that life's most important moments often come without warning, and when they arrive, there is no time to make up for inadequate preparation. The oil of wisdom, of character, of spiritual readiness cannot be borrowed from others when the crisis comes." He paused, allowing the implications of this truth to settle in the quiet room. "Yet there is another lesson here as well," he continued. "The story is not meant to discourage us, but to encourage us to live with greater intentionality, to understand that the small choices we make each day, the habits we form, the wisdom we seek, the character we build, these are the oil we store up for the moments when life calls upon us to shine most brightly." The fire had now settled into a bed of glowing coals that provided warmth without flame, creating an atmosphere perfect for the quiet, contemplative stories that were yet to come. The keeper's voice grew even softer, taking on the gentle rhythm of one who understands that the deepest truths often come wrapped in the simplest images. "There are stories within stories," he said. "Tales that speak of small things that contain great power, of hidden treasures that transform everything they touch, of patient work that yields remarkable results. Let me tell you of a woman who understood the mysterious power of influences that seem insignificant, but prove to be world-changing." The three travelers settled even more deeply into the comfortable silence of the late hour, their hearts open to receive whatever wisdom the remaining stories might offer. Outside, the world slept peacefully under the star-filled sky, and the great road lay empty except for the occasional nocturnal traveler making their way through the quiet darkness. In a small village where life moved at the gentle pace of the seasons, the keeper began, there lived a woman known throughout the community for her skill in baking bread. Her loaves were famous not only for their flavor and texture, but also for their ability to nourish both body and spirit, bringing comfort to the sick, joy to celebrations, and sustenance to all who were fortunate enough to share in her daily work. This woman had learned her craft from her grandmother, who had passed down not only recipes and techniques, but also an understanding of the deeper mysteries that transform simple ingredients into something approaching magic. The secret, her grandmother had taught her, lay not merely in the quality of flour or the temperature of the oven, but in a tiny ingredient that seemed almost insignificant, yet possessed the power to transform everything it touched. This ingredient was leaven, a small portion of fermented dough that carried within itself the living essence of transformation. To those who did not understand its properties, leaven appeared to be nothing more than a small lump of sour-smelling dough, hardly worth noticing among the substantial quantities of flour, water, and salt that formed the visible bulk of each day's baking. Yet the woman knew, as her grandmother had known before her, that without this seemingly insignificant addition, the finest flour and the most careful technique would produce only flat, heavy loaves that nourished the body but failed to lift the spirit. Each morning, as the village still lay quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, the woman would begin her daily ritual of bread-making. She would measure out 3 large measures of flour, the finest available from the local mill, and pile it into a great wooden bowl that had served her family's baking for generations. The flour formed an impressive mountain of white powder, substantial and seemingly complete in itself. But the woman knew that this flour, for all its promise and potential, lacked the essential element that would bring it to life. From a special container, she would take a small portion of leaven, no larger than what she could hold in the palm of her hand, and begin to work it into the massive quantity of flour with patient, gentle movements of her hands. At first, the leaven seemed almost lost in the great bowl of flour, like a single star in the vastness of the night sky. The flour showed no immediate sign of change, no dramatic transformation that would indicate the profound process that had begun to unfold. To a casual observer, it might have seemed that the woman was wasting her time, working so diligently to distribute such a small amount of leaven through such a large quantity of flour. But the woman continued her work with perfect confidence, for she understood that the greatest transformations often begin invisibly, working from within rather than imposing change from without. Her hands moved rhythmically through the flour, ensuring that every portion was touched by the living essence of the leaven, creating the conditions necessary for the miracle that she knew would follow. As she worked, she would often think about the mystery of this transformation, how something so small could have such far-reaching effects. The leaven did not work by force or violence, did not overwhelm the flour with its presence or demand immediate recognition of its power. Instead, it worked quietly and persistently, cell by cell, molecule by molecule, spreading its influence throughout the entire mass of dough in a process that was both gentle and irresistible. Once the leaven was thoroughly distributed, the woman would add water and salt, mixing them into a smooth dough that she would then set aside in a warm place to rest. To those unfamiliar with the process, this period of waiting might have seemed like inactivity, a pause in the work rather than its most crucial phase. But the woman knew that this was when the real work began, when the leaven began its patient transformation of the entire mass of dough. Hour by hour, as the woman went about her other daily tasks, the leaven worked its invisible magic. The dough began to rise, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as the transformation spread throughout every portion of the mixture. What had begun as a dense, heavy mass gradually became light and airy, filled with countless tiny bubbles that spoke of the living process taking place within. The change was not merely physical, but seemed to possess an almost spiritual quality as well. The dough took on a sweet, yeasty aroma that filled the woman's kitchen and spilled out into the street, drawing neighbors who recognized the scent as a promise of good things to come. Children would pause in their play to breathe in the wonderful smell, and adults would find themselves smiling without quite knowing why, touched by something that spoke to deeper hungers than the merely physical. When the rising was complete, the woman would divide the dough and shape it into loaves, each one carrying within itself the transformation that had begun with that small portion of leaven hours earlier. The loaves that emerged from her oven were things of beauty, golden brown and perfectly formed, with crusts that sang as they cooled, and interiors that were tender and full of light. But the woman's understanding of leaven extended far beyond its practical applications in bread-making. She had come to see it as a profound metaphor for how influence spreads in the world, how small actions and attitudes can gradually transform entire communities, how ideas and values that begin in a single heart can eventually change the character of an entire society. She had observed this principle at work in her own village over the years, watching how a single act of kindness could inspire others to similar generosity, how one person's courage in standing up for what was right could encourage others to find their own voices, how the decision of one family to forgive an old wrong could begin a process of healing that eventually touched every household in the community. Like leaven in flour, these influences worked slowly and often invisibly, but their effects were real and lasting. A teacher's patient encouragement of a struggling student might seem insignificant in the moment, but it could plant seeds of confidence that would bear fruit for decades. A neighbor's willingness to help during a time of crisis might appear to be nothing more than common decency, but it could restore someone's faith in human goodness and inspire them to extend similar help to others. The woman had also learned to recognize the negative applications of this same principle, how fear and hatred could spread through a community just as surely as love and hope, how a single person's bitterness could gradually poison the atmosphere of an entire neighborhood if left unchecked. Like leaven, these influences worked from within, often beginning with small comments or subtle attitudes that seemed harmless, but gradually infected larger and larger circles of relationship. This understanding had made her more conscious of her own influence, more aware of how her words and actions rippled outward in ways she might never fully comprehend. She tried to ensure that the leaven she contributed to her community was the kind that would nourish rather than corrupt, that would build up rather than tear down, that would create the conditions for flourishing rather than decay. Her bread making became a form of prayer, a daily meditation on the mystery of transformation and influence. As she worked the leaven into the flour each morning, she would reflect on the ways she hoped to work positive influence into the life of her community. As she watched the dough rise, she would consider how patience and time were essential elements in all lasting change. As she shaped the loaves for baking, she would think about how individual actions could take forms that would nourish and sustain others. The people of her village, though they might not have been able to articulate the deeper lessons embedded in her daily work, sensed something special about both her bread and her presence in their community. Her kitchen became a gathering place where neighbors would come not only to purchase bread, but also to share their troubles and joys, knowing that they would find both practical help and gentle wisdom. Children would stop by after school, drawn not only by the possibility of a warm roll fresh from the oven, but also by the woman's ability to listen to their concerns with the kind of patience and understanding that made them feel valued and heard. Adults facing difficult decisions would find themselves seeking her counsel, trusting in the wisdom of someone who understood how small choices could have large consequences. The woman's influence spread through the village much like leaven through flour, quietly but persistently transforming the character of the community. Her commitment to kindness encouraged others to be more generous with their time and resources. Her practice of speaking well of others helped to reduce the gossip and criticism that had once poisoned many relationships. Her willingness to see the best in people inspired them to live up to her expectations, creating an upward spiral of positive change. Years passed, and the woman grew older, her hands becoming more gnarled but no less skilled in their daily work with flour and leaven. She began to train younger women in the art of bread making, passing on not only the technical knowledge, but also the deeper understanding of how small influences could create large transformations. Remember, she would tell her students as they worked together in the pre-dawn darkness, the leaven seems insignificant compared to the flour, but without it, all our effort produces only heavy, lifeless bread. In the same way, your kind words, your patient example, your willingness to forgive and encourage, these may seem small in the face of the world's great troubles, but they carry within themselves the power to transform everything they touch. Chatlik tu. Her students learned not only to recognize when the dough had risen sufficiently, but also to understand how their own attitudes and actions could serve as leaven in their families and communities. They discovered that transformation was not usually a matter of dramatic gestures or grand pronouncements, but of consistent, patient work that trusted in the invisible processes by which good influence spreads from heart to heart. One of her students, a young woman whose family had recently moved to the village, was particularly struck by these lessons. She had come from a place where mistrust and conflict had made life difficult and joyless, and she was amazed to discover how different the atmosphere was in this new community. The spirit of cooperation and mutual support that characterized the village seemed almost too good to be true. "How did this community become so different from others I have known?" she asked her teacher one morning as they worked together preparing the day's bread. The older woman smiled, her hands never pausing in their rhythmic kneading. "It was not always so," she said. "When I was young, this village was much like others, full of petty jealousies and old grudges, suspicious of strangers and quick to assume the worst about neighbors. But gradually, one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of choosing forgiveness over resentment at a time, the character of our community began to change." She shaped a portion of dough into a round loaf, her movements sure and practiced. "It takes time," she continued, "just as bread takes time to rise. You cannot hurry the process, but if you are patient and consistent, if you trust in the power of small, good influences to multiply and spread, you will eventually see transformation that seemed impossible when you began." The young woman pondered these words as she worked, beginning to understand that she too had a role to play in the ongoing transformation of her new community. She was not merely a recipient of its goodness, but a contributor to its continued flourishing, responsible for adding her own portion of positive leaven to the mixture of relationships and influences that shaped daily life in the village. As the keeper paused in his telling of this story, he rose to add a small piece of wood to the fire, which responded with a brief flare that illuminated the faces of his three listeners before settling back into its gentle glow. The night had grown very deep around them, and the sense of intimacy and reflection in the room had deepened as well. "The story of the leaven," he said, resuming his seat, "reminds us that we are all participants in the great work of transformation that shapes our world. Each of us carries within ourselves the potential to be a positive influence, to add something to the mixture of human relationships that will help the whole community rise to its best possibilities." The young merchant nodded thoughtfully. "It makes me think about my business differently," he said. "I have been focused on the large transactions, the major deals that seem important, but perhaps the small kindnesses, the fair treatment of each customer, the honest dealing in minor matters, these may have influences that spread much further than I have realized." The woman leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "And it speaks to the question of patience," she said. "So often we want to see immediate results from our efforts to make positive changes, but this story suggests that the most lasting transformations happen slowly, almost invisibly, requiring faith in processes we cannot always see or measure." The old shepherd added his own reflection. "With sheep," he said, "I have learned that the health of the entire flock depends on the health of each individual animal. One sick sheep can infect many others, but one strong, healthy sheep can also inspire the others to move toward better pasture and safer ground." The keeper smiled at these insights, pleased to see how each person was finding personal applications for the ancient wisdom. "Yes," he said, "and this brings us to another story, one that speaks of how sometimes the most precious things come in the smallest packages, how the greatest treasures are often hidden in the most unlikely places." He paused to sip from his cup of herbal tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals that caught the firelight. "There was once a merchant," he began, "who had spent his entire life in the pursuit of a single perfect treasure, something so valuable and beautiful that its possession would justify all the searching and sacrifice that such a quest requires. This merchant was not driven by ordinary greed or the simple desire for wealth, but by a vision of perfection that had captured his imagination in youth and never released its hold upon his heart. He had heard stories, passed down through generations of traders and travelers, of a pearl so magnificent that it seemed to contain within its lustrous surface all the beauty and mystery of the sea itself. Such pearls, the stories claimed, were formed not through the ordinary processes that created common pearls, but through rare and extraordinary circumstances that occurred perhaps once in a generation. They grew in the depths of the ocean, in shells that lived in places so remote and dangerous that few divers ever attempted to reach them. The formation of such a pearl required not only perfect conditions, but also decades of patient growth, layer upon layer of lustrous material building, slowly into something of incomparable beauty. The merchant had dedicated his life to learning everything he could about pearls, studying their formation, understanding their varieties, developing the expertise necessary to recognize true quality when he encountered it. He had traveled to every coast where pearls were harvested, had built relationships with the most skilled divers and the most knowledgeable dealers, had examined thousands of specimens in his patient search for the one perfect treasure that would crown his life's work. His quest had taken him to tropical islands where the water was so clear that divers could see the ocean floor from the surface, to rocky coasts where the waves crashed with such force that only the most courageous would attempt to work in such conditions, to hidden lagoons where ancient diving traditions were passed down from father to son in secrets that outsiders rarely learned. Along the way, he had acquired many beautiful pearls, some of which were considered treasures by any reasonable standard. His collection was famous among those who dealt in such things, and other merchants often came to him seeking his expertise or hoping to purchase pieces from his carefully curated inventory. He could have retired comfortably on the value of what he had already accumulated, living in luxury for the rest of his days. But none of these pearls, however beautiful or valuable, satisfied the vision that drove his searching. He could see their flaws, could recognize the ways in which they fell short of the perfect standard that existed in his imagination. They were lovely, but they were not the pearl he sought, the one treasure that would justify a lifetime of patient searching and careful accumulation. Years passed, and the merchant's hair grew gray with the salt spray of countless voyages. His hands became weathered by the handling of thousands of pearls. His eyes grew sharp with the ability to detect the subtlest variations in color and luster. Other merchants began to consider him obsessed, unable to appreciate the very real treasures he possessed because of his fixation on an impossible ideal. But the merchant continued his search with undiminished determination, confident that such a pearl existed somewhere in the vast oceans of the world and that his persistence would eventually be rewarded. He had learned to be patient, to understand that the greatest treasures were not found by those who sought quick profits, but by those who were willing to invest years or even decades in the pursuit of something truly extraordinary. Then came the day when a young diver, newly arrived from a distant coast that few merchants had ever visited, approached him with a small, carefully wrapped package. The young man's manner was respectful but confident, and something in his eyes suggested that he carried with him something genuinely special. "I have heard of your reputation," the diver said, "and of your search for the perfect pearl. I believe I may have something that will interest you, though I must warn you that its price will be higher than anything you have ever considered paying." The merchant's heart quickened with anticipation, but his expression remained calm and professional. He had been disappointed too many times to allow himself to hope too quickly. Yet something about this young man's quiet confidence suggested that this encounter might be different from all the others. With careful movements, the diver unwrapped his package, revealing a pearl that took the merchant's breath away. It was neither the largest nor the most dramatically colored pearl he had ever seen, but it possessed a quality of perfection that was immediately and undeniably apparent. The surface was flawless, the luster deep and mysterious, the overall form so perfectly rounded that it seemed to have been shaped by divine rather than natural forces. As the merchant held the pearl up to the light, It seemed to glow with an inner radiance that transformed the simple illumination of the oil lamp into something approaching magic. The pearl's surface reflected the light in layers, creating depths of color and brilliance that seemed to shift and change as he turned it in his hands. This was the treasure he had been seeking, the perfect pearl that justified every sacrifice he had made in its pursuit. "How much?" he asked simply, though his voice betrayed the emotion that the discovery had stirred within him. The diver named a price that was staggering, more than the value of all the other pearls in the merchant's collection combined. It was a sum that would require him to sell everything he owned, to liquidate his entire inventory, to give up all the security and comfort that his years of successful trading had provided. For a moment, the merchant hesitated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision before him. This single purchase would transform him from a wealthy man with a substantial inventory to someone who owned nothing but this one perfect pearl. It would mean starting over completely, rebuilding his life and his business from nothing, trusting that this one treasure would somehow justify such an enormous sacrifice. But as he held the pearl and felt its perfect weight in his hand, as he saw how its beauty seemed to transform everything around it, the merchant knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he had been seeking all his life. This pearl was not just another addition to his collection, but the treasure that gave meaning to all his searching, the discovery that justified every risk he had taken and every comfort he had foregone. Without further hesitation, he agreed to the diver's price. In the days that followed, he sold everything he owned, liquidating his entire collection of pearls, disposing of his houses and ships and trading goods, converting everything he had accumulated over a lifetime into the gold necessary to complete this one extraordinary purchase. His fellow merchants thought he had lost his mind, sacrificing a comfortable and secure future for the sake of a single pearl, however beautiful it might be. They could not understand how one treasure, regardless of its perfection, could be worth more than the diversified wealth and steady income that he was giving up. But the merchant felt no regret, no second thoughts about the choice he had made. As he held his perfect pearl, he understood that he had discovered something that transcended ordinary calculations of value and utility. This was not merely a beautiful object, but a manifestation of perfection itself, a treasure that connected him to the deepest mysteries of beauty and meaning. The pearl transformed not only his material circumstances, but also his understanding of what truly mattered in life. He had spent years accumulating many good things, building a collection that others envied, and a reputation that brought him respect and security. But none of these achievements had brought him the satisfaction and sense of completion that came from possessing this one perfect treasure. In the quiet moments of the evening, as he contemplated his pearl by lamplight, the merchant would reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. He understood now that all his previous searching and collecting had been preparation for this moment, training that had developed his ability to recognize true perfection when he finally encountered it. The pearl became his teacher as well as his treasure, showing him how perfection was not about size or obvious display, but about an inner quality that transformed everything it touched. Its beauty was not aggressive or demanding, but gentle and transformative, revealing new depths the longer one contemplated it. As the keeper concluded this portion of his story, he paused to let the silence deepen around them. The fire had burned very low, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and reflection that seemed perfect for contemplating the mysteries of value and meaning that the story explored. "The merchant's choice," he said softly, "teaches us about the difference between having many good things and possessing the one thing that makes all the difference. Sometimes the greatest wisdom lies in being willing to sacrifice everything we have accumulated for the sake of the one treasure that truly matters." The three travelers sat in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own reflections about the choices they had made and the values that guided their lives. The woman was the first to speak, her voice quiet and contemplative. "I find myself wondering," she said, "whether I have been like the merchant before he found his perfect pearl, accumulating many things that are good but not essential, perhaps missing opportunities to discover what would truly bring meaning to my life." The young merchant nodded slowly. "The story challenges everything I thought I understood about wealth and security," he said. "I have been working to build up reserves and diversify my holdings, but perhaps there are some things worth risking everything to obtain." The old shepherd added his own reflection. "In my simple life with the sheep," he said, "I have learned that there is great peace in having one thing that you do well and love deeply, rather than many things that merely fill up your time and attention." The keeper smiled at these insights, understanding that each person was grappling with the story's implications for their own choices and priorities. "The pearl merchant's wisdom," he said, "lies in his ability to recognize that some treasures are worth any sacrifice, and in his courage to act on that recognition even when others cannot understand his choice." He rose once more to tend the fire, adding just enough fuel to maintain the gentle warmth without creating bright flames that might disturb the contemplative atmosphere. "There is one more story," he said, "that speaks to the heart of what it means to care for others, to take responsibility for their welfare, to love them with the kind of love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the good of those who are beloved." As he settled back into his chair, the keeper's voice took on an even gentler quality, filled with the tenderness that comes from speaking about the deepest mysteries of love and care. "There was once a shepherd," he began, "whose love for his flock went far beyond the ordinary concern of a hired worker for animals in his charge. This was not merely his profession, but his calling, not just his work, but his life's purpose. This shepherd had grown up among sheep, learning the art of tending them from his father and grandfather, inheriting not only their practical knowledge, but also their understanding of the sacred responsibility that comes with caring for vulnerable creatures. From childhood, he had observed how each sheep had its own personality and needs, how the health of the entire flock depended on attention to each individual animal, how the shepherd's vigilance and care meant the difference between safety and disaster. His flock was not large by the standards of some of the great estates, but every sheep in it was known to him individually, recognized not just by its physical appearance, but by its character, its habits, its place in the complex social structure of the group. He could tell when one was feeling unwell before any obvious symptoms appeared, could predict which sheep might be tempted to wander away from the safety of the group, could sense danger approaching long before it became visible to less experienced eyes. The shepherd's care for his flock was evident in countless small details that others might not notice, but that made all the difference in the daily life of the sheep. He knew which pastures provided the most nutritious grazing at different times of the year, which water sources were safest and most reliable, which paths through the hills avoided the areas where predators were most likely to hunt. His staff was worn smooth by years of use, perfectly balanced for the work of guiding and protecting his charges. He had carved it himself from wood taken from a tree on his family's land, and it had become an extension of his own body, as natural in his hand as his own arm. With it, he could gently guide a sheep back toward the flock, could reach a lamb that had become trapped in a thicket, could defend against wolves or other predators that threatened his charges. The shepherd's knowledge of his terrain was encyclopedic, gained through years of walking the same hills and valleys in all seasons and all weather conditions. He knew every rock and tree, every stream and cave, every place where sheep might find shelter from storms or refuge from the heat of the summer sun. This knowledge had been built up gradually through patient observation and careful attention to the way the landscape changed with the seasons and the years. But more than his technical knowledge or his physical skills, what distinguished this shepherd was the depth of his commitment to the welfare of his flock. Other shepherds might do their work competently during the daylight hours, but think little about their sheep once they return to their homes in the evening. This shepherd, however, carried his responsibility with him always, waking in the night if a storm arose to worry about whether his flock was safe, feeling personally accountable for every animal in his care. His voice was familiar to every sheep in the flock, and they responded to his calls with the trust that comes from long experience of protection and care. When he led them to new pastures, they followed without hesitation, confident that he would guide them to places of safety and abundance. When danger threatened, they looked to him for protection, knowing that he would place himself between them and whatever might harm them. The shepherd understood that his role required not only skill and knowledge, but also sacrifice and courage. There were nights when he slept little because storms or predators kept him alert to potential dangers. There were days when his own comfort was secondary to the needs of sheep that required his attention and care. There were times when he faced genuine danger in protecting his flock from wolves or thieves who would steal or kill his charges for their own profit. Yet he embraced these challenges willingly, understanding that true love for those in his care meant being willing to pay whatever price their protection might require. His sheep were not merely his livelihood, but his responsibility, creatures whose welfare had been entrusted to him and for whom he was accountable to something higher than his own convenience or safety. One evening, as the shepherd was leading his flock back to their fold after a day of grazing in the hill pastures, he noticed that one sheep was missing from the group. It was a young ewe, not yet fully mature, but old enough to know better than to wander away from the safety of the flock. She was known for her curiosity and her tendency to explore interesting sights or sounds that caught her attention, a trait that made her endearing but also potentially dangerous. The shepherd's first instinct was to count the flock again, hoping that he had made an error and that all his sheep were actually present and accounted for. But the recount confirmed his initial observation. 99 sheep were safely gathered, but one was missing, and he knew exactly which one it was. As darkness began to gather in the valleys and the air grew cool with the approach of night, the shepherd faced a difficult decision. The 99 sheep in his care were tired from their day of grazing and eager to return to the security of their fold, where they would be protected from night predators and could rest peacefully until morning. The sensible course would be to secure these sheep first, ensuring their safety before attempting any rescue of the missing animal. But the shepherd's heart was torn by the knowledge that somewhere in the growing darkness, one of his sheep was alone and vulnerable, probably frightened and possibly in immediate danger. Every hour that passed without finding her increased the likelihood that wolves or other predators would discover her before he could reach her. The night was full of dangers that a solitary sheep could not survive without protection. Without hesitation, the shepherd made his choice. He led the 99 sheep to a secure pasture where they would be safe until his return, ensuring that they had access to water and shelter. Then, taking only his staff and a small oil lamp, he set out into the darkening hills to search for the one sheep that was lost. The search was difficult and dangerous, made more challenging by the fading light and the rough terrain of the hillsides where the missing sheep might have wandered. The shepherd called her name repeatedly, his voice echoing off the rocky slopes as he searched every ravine and thicket where she might have become trapped or hidden. Hours passed as he climbed higher into the hills, following faint traces of her passage, listening for any sound that might indicate her location. His lamp cast only a small circle of light in the vast darkness, and more than once he stumbled over rocks or roots hidden in the shadows. The night air grew cold, and he could hear the distant howling of wolves that reminded him of the urgency of his mission. It was well past midnight when he finally heard a faint bleating from a narrow canyon that cut deep into the hillside. Following the sound, he discovered the missing ewe trapped on a narrow ledge, unable to climb up or down, frightened and exhausted from hours of calling for help that had not come. The rescue was treacherous, requiring the shepherd to climb down the rocky wall of the canyon, using only the uncertain light of his lamp and the skill gained from years of navigating difficult terrain. More than once, loose stones slipped under his feet, threatening to send him tumbling into the darkness below. But his concern for the trapped sheep outweighed his concern for his own safety, and he persevered until he reached the ledge where she waited. The ewe was overjoyed to see her shepherd, pressing against him with relief and gratitude, trusting him completely to lead her to safety. Carefully, patiently, he guided her along the treacherous path back up the canyon wall, supporting her when the way became too difficult, encouraging her when fear made her reluctant to continue. When they finally emerged from the canyon onto safer ground, the shepherd felt a joy that far exceeded what might have been expected from the recovery of a single sheep. This was not merely the successful completion of a difficult task, but the restoration of a relationship, the healing of his flock's wholeness, the demonstration of a love that would not abandon even one of those entrusted to his care. As they made their way back toward the fold where the other sheep waited, the shepherd found himself singing with happiness, his voice carrying across the hillsides in celebration of the successful rescue. The night that had begun with worry and fear had ended with rejoicing and restoration, a pattern that he had experienced many times before, but that never failed to fill him with wonder and gratitude. When he arrived at the fold with the rescued sheep, the reunion with the rest of the flock was joyful and complete. The 99 sheep that had waited safely through the night seemed to sense that something important had been accomplished, and the missing ewe was welcomed back into the group with the kind of acceptance that spoke to the deep bonds that connected them all. The shepherd's neighbors, when they learned of the night's adventure, marveled at the risks he had taken for the sake of a single sheep. Some questioned the wisdom of leaving 99 sheep, however secure, to search for one that might already have been killed by predators. Surely, they argued, the loss of one sheep, while regrettable, was an acceptable price to pay for ensuring the continued safety of the larger flock. But the shepherd understood something about love and responsibility that his neighbors had not yet grasped. To him, the value of each individual sheep was not diminished by the number of others in his care. The 99 that were safe were precious to him, but their safety did not make the welfare of the missing one any less important. True love, he knew, does not calculate the relative value of those it protects, but extends itself fully to each one who is in need. His care for the flock was not merely a professional responsibility, but a personal commitment that reflected his understanding of what it meant to be a shepherd, worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. Each sheep had been entrusted to his care as an individual, valuable in itself, deserving of protection and rescue regardless of the cost or inconvenience involved. The story of that night's rescue became part of the shepherd's reputation in the community, but for him, it was simply an example of the kind of care that his role required every day. He understood that shepherding was not just about managing a group of animals for economic benefit, but about maintaining relationships of trust and protection that honored the sacred nature of the responsibility he had accepted. Years passed, and the shepherd grew older, his hair becoming gray and his steps somewhat slower. But his commitment to his flock never wavered. He trained younger men in the art of shepherding, teaching them not only the practical skills they would need, but also the deeper understanding of what it meant to truly care for those entrusted to their protection. Remember, he would tell his students as they walked together through the pastures, each sheep is irreplaceable, valuable not because of what it contributes to the whole, but because of what it is in itself. A true shepherd knows every sheep individually and would risk everything to protect even the least of them. His pupils learn to recognize the signs of illness or distress in their charges, to understand the seasonal patterns that affected grazing and safety, to develop the physical skills necessary for guiding and protecting sheep in difficult terrain. But most importantly, they learn to see their work as a calling rather than merely a job, a sacred responsibility that required the best of their character and commitment. The shepherd's life became a living parable of love that sacrifices itself for others, care that extends equally to all regardless of their status or contribution, protection that never calculates the cost of doing what is right. His example influenced not only those who worked directly with him, but the entire community, which came to understand that true leadership meant serving the needs of those who were vulnerable and dependent. As the keeper brought this final story to its close, the fire had burned down to its last glowing embers, and the deep stillness of the night had settled completely around the house. The three travelers sat in profound silence, each absorbed in reflection on the evening's journey through these ancient tales of wisdom and love. The shepherd's love, the keeper said softly, shows us what it means to care for others with the kind of devotion that seeks nothing for itself, but only the welfare of those who are beloved. It is a love that knows the value of each individual life, that will risk everything to protect even the most vulnerable, that finds its greatest joy not in being served, but in serving others. The room fell quiet again as each person contemplated the implications of what they had heard. Outside, the great road lay peaceful under the starlight, waiting for the morning to bring new travelers who would continue their own journeys toward whatever destinations called to their hearts. The young merchant was the first to speak, his voice filled with new understanding. "These stories have changed something in me," he said. "I began this evening thinking about my own journey and my own goals, but now I find myself wondering how I can become the kind of person who adds value to the lives of others, who takes responsibility for something larger than my own success." The woman nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I came here carrying old wounds and wondering whether forgiveness was possible," she said. "Tonight I have learned that love is larger than I imagined, more patient than I believed, more willing to sacrifice for others than I thought could be real." The old shepherd smiled, his weathered face creased with deep contentment. "And I have been reminded," he said, "that the work I have done all my life, caring for sheep and protecting them from harm, is part of something sacred, a reflection of the kind of love that holds the entire world together." The keeper rose one last time to bank the fire for the night, ensuring that its warmth would last until morning brought new light and new possibilities. As he worked with the glowing coals, arranging them carefully for the hours ahead, he spoke in the gentle voice of one who understands that the most important journeys often end where they began, but with hearts transformed by what has been discovered along the way. "The stories we have shared tonight," he said, settling back into his chair with the quiet satisfaction of one whose work has been well done, "are like seeds planted in fertile ground. They will continue to grow in your hearts long after you have left this place, revealing new meanings as your own experiences give you new eyes to see their truths." The three travelers felt the weight of this observation, understanding that they would carry these tales with them wherever their journeys might lead, finding in them guidance for choices yet to be made and comfort for challenges yet to be faced. The stories had become part of them now, woven into the fabric of their understanding in ways that would influence their thoughts and actions for years to come. "But perhaps," the keeper continued, his voice growing even softer as the night deepened around them, "the greatest gift these stories offer is not their individual lessons, but their collective witness to the truth that we are all connected, all part of a larger story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone." He gazed into the glowing embers, his eyes reflecting their warm light as he spoke of mysteries that transcended the boundaries of any single tale. The prodigal son who finds his way home, the wounded traveler who discovers mercy in unexpected places, the servants who learn to use their gifts wisely, the maidens who prepare for life's great moments, the woman whose influence spreads like leaven through her community, the merchant who recognizes ultimate value when he finds it, the shepherd who cares for each individual life with perfect devotion. All of these are part of one great story about what it means to be human, to love and be loved, to lose and find again. The room had grown very quiet, with only the soft sounds of their breathing and the gentle settling of the coals in the fireplace to mark the passage of time. The oil lamps burned with steady flames that cast everything in warm, golden light, creating an atmosphere of peace and contentment that seemed to wrap around them like a comfortable blanket. "When morning comes," the keeper said, "each of you will continue on your way, carrying these stories with you like treasures hidden in your hearts. You will encounter other travelers on the road, some seeking their own way home, others nursing wounds that need healing, still others searching for meaning and purpose in their lives." He paused, allowing the implications of these words to settle in their minds. "And when you meet these fellow journeyers, you will have the opportunity to become part of their stories, just as tonight you have become part of mine. You may find yourself called to be the father welcoming a returning child, or the stranger showing mercy to one in need, or the wise friend who helps another recognize the treasures already within their grasp." The young merchant shifted in his chair, his heart stirred by the vision of a life lived in service to others' well-being. "How will I know," he asked, "when such moments arise? How can I be sure that I will recognize the opportunities to make a difference in someone else's story?" The keeper smiled, understanding the young man's desire for clear guidance in a world that often seemed confusing and complex. "The heart that has been touched by these truths," he said, "develops a sensitivity to the needs of others that grows stronger with practice. You will begin to notice the loneliness behind someone's busy facade, the fear beneath another's anger, the hope hidden in what might appear to be despair." The woman leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful and intent. "And what of our own stories?" she asked. "How do we know which role we are playing in our own lives, whether we are the prodigal or the elder brother, the wounded traveler or the good Samaritan?" "Ah," said the keeper, his eyes twinkling with gentle wisdom, "that is perhaps the most important question of all. For in truth, we are all of these characters at different times and in different circumstances. Life has a way of placing us in various roles, sometimes within the same day, sometimes over the course of years." He settled back more deeply into his chair, his voice taking on the reflective tone of one who has observed the patterns of human experience across many years. "You may begin a day as the faithful elder brother, reliable and responsible, only to discover by evening that you need the grace extended to prodigals. You may start a journey as one in need of rescue, but find yourself called to be the rescuer of another before you reach your destination." The old shepherd nodded slowly, recognizing the truth of these observations from his own long experience. "It seems to me," he said, "that the wisdom lies not in trying to choose which character to be, but in being open to whatever role love requires of us in each moment." "Exactly so," the keeper replied with evident pleasure. "The stories teach us flexibility of heart, the ability to respond to life's changing demands with grace and wisdom. They prepare us for the full range of human experience, from the heights of joy to the depths of sorrow, from the satisfaction of being helpful to others to the humility of needing help ourselves." As the night continued its gentle progression toward dawn, the conversation gradually gave way to comfortable silence, each person lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this place and the paths that would carry them forward. The stories seemed to continue resonating in the quiet spaces between words, working their transformative magic in the depths of hearts that had been opened to receive their wisdom. The keeper rose quietly and moved about the room, checking the oil in the lamps, adjusting the damper on the fireplace, ensuring that his guests would be comfortable through the remaining hours until morning. His movements were those of one who had performed these caring tasks countless times, yet who brought to them the same attention and gentleness that characterized all his interactions with those who sought refuge in his house. "Rest now," he said softly, his voice carrying the blessing of one who understands that sleep is itself a gift, a time when the conscious mind steps aside and allows deeper wisdom to take root in the soul. Let these stories settle into your hearts like seeds finding their proper soil. When you wake, you will find them still there, but perhaps arranged in new patterns that will guide your steps in ways you cannot yet imagine. The three travelers found themselves growing drowsy, not from boredom or fatigue, but from the deep contentment that comes when the soul has been nourished with exactly what it needed. The stories had filled spaces in their hearts they had not even known were empty, had answered questions they had not known how to ask, had provided comfort for sorrows they had thought would never heal. One by one, they settled into the comfortable chairs and benches that the keeper had arranged for their rest, pulling soft blankets around themselves as the night air grew cooler. The fire continued to provide gentle warmth, and the oil lamps burned steadily, creating an atmosphere of safety and peace that invited the deepest kind of rest. As they drifted toward sleep, each traveler carried with them the images and insights that had most deeply touched their individual hearts. The young merchant found himself dreaming of roads that led not just to profitable destinations, but to opportunities for service and generosity. The woman felt old bitterness melting away like snow in spring sunshine, replaced by a capacity for forgiveness she had not known she possessed. The old shepherd rested in the profound satisfaction of understanding that his simple life of caring for vulnerable creatures was itself a form of sacred service. The keeper remained awake a while longer, tending the fire and watching over his guests with the same gentle care that the good shepherd had shown for his flock. He understood that his role as keeper of this house was not merely to provide physical shelter, but to offer the kind of hospitality that refreshed both body and spirit, that sent travelers on their way not just rested, but transformed. In the quiet hours before dawn, as his guests slept peacefully around the dying fire, the keeper reflected on the mystery of stories and their power to change lives. He had told these same tales countless times to countless travelers, yet each telling was unique. Each audience brought their own needs and understanding to the ancient wisdom. Each heart was touched in its own particular way by truths that were both universal and deeply personal. He thought about the great road that passed his door, carrying an endless stream of humanity in all its varieties and conditions. Rich and poor, young and old, hopeful and despairing, all found their way eventually to his threshold, drawn by needs they might not even be able to articulate, but which his house and his stories somehow managed to address. Some travelers stayed only one night, receiving what they needed and moving on refreshed and redirected. Others remained for several days, working through deeper questions that required more time and reflection to resolve. A few had stayed for weeks or even months, becoming temporary members of his household, while they healed from wounds that ran deeper than the merely physical. But all of them, regardless of the length of their stay, carried something of these stories with them when they departed. The keeper understood that he was part of a great chain of transmission, receiving ancient wisdom from those who had come before and passing it on to those who would come after, ensuring that these essential truths would continue to find new hearts and minds in each generation. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gold, the keeper made his final preparations for the morning. He quietly added wood to the fire so that it would burn brightly when his guests awakened, prepared simple but nourishing food for their breakfast, and ensured that everything they might need for the next stage of their journeys was ready and available. The young merchant was the first to stir, awakening gradually as the growing light touched his face. He lay still for a moment, allowing the memories of the previous evening to flow back into his consciousness, marveling at how different the world seemed now that these stories had become part of his understanding. The anxieties and ambitions that had driven him for so long felt somehow less urgent, replaced by a quieter but deeper sense of purpose. The woman awoke next, stretching gently and feeling a lightness in her heart that she had not experienced for years. The old griefs and resentments that had weighed her down seemed to have lost their power during the night, transformed by the gentle but persistent influence of the stories she had received. She felt ready to return to her life with new capacity for joy and forgiveness. The old shepherd's awakening was the quietest of all, a gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness that seemed to flow as naturally as the progression from night to day. He felt confirmed in the value of his simple life, understanding now that his daily work was part of something sacred that connected him to the deepest truths about love and care and responsibility. The keeper greeted each of them with warm smiles and simple words of blessing, offering the kind of breakfast that satisfies both hunger and the soul's need for comfort and nurturing. They ate together in companionable silence, each processing the previous evening's experiences in their own way, all sensing that something significant had shifted in their understanding of themselves and their place in the larger story of human existence. As the morning progressed and the time came for departure, each traveler expressed their gratitude to the keeper in their own way. The young merchant offered payment for the hospitality he had received, but the keeper gently declined, explaining that the house was maintained by the gifts of those who chose to give, never by obligation or demand. The woman embraced the keeper with tears of gratitude, speaking of how the stories had healed wounds she had thought would never close. The old shepherd simply clasped the keeper's hand in his own weathered grip, a gesture that communicated more than words could express about the value of what had been shared. As they prepared to return to the great road and continue their individual journeys, the keeper stood in his doorway, watching them with the satisfaction of one whose work has been well done. He knew that these three travelers would carry the stories with them wherever they went, and that in turn they would become part of other people's stories, spreading the influence of love and wisdom like the woman's leaven through whatever communities they encountered. The young merchant turned back once as he reached the bend in the road, raising his hand in a final gesture of farewell. He was already thinking about how he might conduct his business differently, how he might look for opportunities to be of service to others rather than merely pursuing profit for himself. The stories had given him a new framework for understanding success, one that measured value not just in terms of material gain, but in terms of the positive influence one could have on the lives of others. The woman walked with a lighter step than she had known for years, her heart singing with the freedom that comes from forgiveness given and received. She was eager to return to relationships that had been damaged by old hurts, armed now with the understanding that love was larger and more patient than she had previously believed possible. The stories had shown her that redemption was always possible, that no one was ever too lost to find their way home to love and acceptance. The old shepherd continued his journey with quiet contentment, understanding now that his life of caring for sheep was itself a form of ministry, a way of participating in the great work of love that sustains the world. He would return to his flock with new appreciation for the sacred nature of his responsibility, seeing in each sheep a creature worthy of the same kind of devoted care that the shepherd in the story had shown. As the keeper watched them disappear around the bend in the road, he felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that seeds have been planted in fertile ground, that stories have found their way into hearts where they will continue to grow and bear fruit for years to come. He returned to his house, already preparing for the next travelers who would surely come, carrying their own needs and questions, ready to receive whatever wisdom the ancient stories might offer to their particular circumstances. The great road continued its eternal function, carrying the endless stream of humanity through the landscape of their lives, connecting distant places and distant hearts through the simple act of journey. And the keeper's house remained what it had always been, a place of refuge and renewal, where weary travelers could find not just physical rest, but the deeper refreshment that comes from encountering stories that speak to the eternal truths of human existence. The stories themselves lived on, as they always had and always would, finding new voices to tell them and new hearts to receive them, adapting to each generation's needs while maintaining their essential wisdom about love and forgiveness, about responsibility and redemption, about the mysterious ways in which individual lives are woven together into the great tapestry of human experience. And somewhere along the road, other travelers were already making their way toward the keeper's house, drawn by their own needs and longings, ready to discover for themselves the transformative power of ancient wisdom shared in the gentle hours between sunset and dawn, when hearts are most open to receive the gifts that stories offer to those who are willing to listen with more than their ears. The circle continued, as it always had, as it always would, carrying forward the essential truths that make us human, that teach us how to love and be loved, that show us the way home to the deepest sources of meaning and purpose that give life its true value. The stories waited, patient and eternal, ready to offer their wisdom to any heart prepared to receive it, any soul willing to be transformed by the encounter with truths that are both ancient and eternally new. Rest now, dear listener, and let these stories settle into your heart like seeds finding their proper home. When you wake, you will find them still there, ready to guide your steps and illuminate your path as you continue your own journey along the great road of life, where every encounter holds the possibility of transformation, and every act of love adds another thread to the tapestry of stories that connect us all.